Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the third of our three fall lectures of the 2025 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. On behalf of the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, we are pleased to continue our collaboration with the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter and host this lecture series. And now I'd like to introduce John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, an architect, who serves as president of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He'll introduce our speaker for this evening's talk. John?
Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our Architecture Around the World lecture series. It is my privilege to introduce our friend and colleague and tonight's speaker. Robert J. Moore Jr. is a senior lecturer at Washington University in St. Louis in the Sam Fox School and a retired public historian for the National Park Service. Bob is vice president of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Syracuse University and master's and PhD degrees in history from Washington University in St. Louis. He is currently at work on a biography of landscape architect Dan Kiley. Tonight, Bob will talk about History of Women in Architecture series, Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan designed some 700 buildings during her career and was the first woman to graduate from the architectural program of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. She was also the first woman to be awarded the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal posthumously in 2014. This talk will delve into her background and family life, her work habits, and the way she ran her architectural firm between the years 1904 and 1951. Although most famous as the architect of the famous Hearst Castle, Morgan also designed churches, women's clubs, a retreat center, a fantasy village, schools, residences, and college buildings. The major portion of the talk will be devoted to these other buildings, only touching upon the castle near the end. And now, please welcome Bob Moore as he presents History of Women in Architecture series, Julia Morgan.
First, I want to thank the Society of Architectural Historians for having me speak once again and kind of continue this little series about women in architecture. And I wanted to apologize for not being with you in person. I've got some personal items I have to take care of and cannot make the date that I originally had agreed to. So please forgive me for not being there. And I hope that the program this evening will still be of interest and you'll come away knowing a little bit more about our subject for tonight, Julia Morgan. So I wanted to thank Trent Sindelar of the St. Louis Public Library and John Gunther of the Society of Architectural Historians for hosting this and having me back again. So without further ado, I guess we can get started. I'm going to switch over so that you can see the slides I'm going to be showing, and we'll get going from there. Right. So last spring, I did a talk on women who worked as architects in the very early historical times in Europe. And as I said then, women have always been part of the design field, but in past times, they worked in such small numbers that they were far easier to overlook than they are today, when 50% of architecture students are women. Tonight, I'd like to speak about one architect in particular, Julia Morgan, by far the most famous early woman in the design field. She was the first woman to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts and the first woman licensed to practice architecture in California. And she designed more than 700 buildings during a very long and prolific career. She also was the first woman to receive the American Institute of Architects' highest award, the AIA Gold Medal, which was awarded posthumously in 2014. In 1931, in the midst of her busy career, Julia Morgan was interviewed for the Christian Science Monitor. In response to their most obvious question, she said, "I think it's too early to say what contribution women are making in the field of architecture. The few professional women architects have contributed little or nothing to the profession. They have, however, done sincere, good work along with the tide." So Morgan, in this rare interview, confirmed the common belief that women were most influential as designers of non-monumental projects. She felt those who practiced as architects just worked, quote, with the tide, unquote, and characterized their designs as sincere and good rather than exciting or challenging. By 1931, Morgan was California's most respected and prolific woman in the field and had been in independent practice since 1906. She grappled for decades with the problem of gender and architecture. Her pessimistic response reflects the struggle that she waged. This rather disillusioned person that we see in the interview is, in modern revisionist inclusive history texts, often only the token woman, with scant, if any, evaluation of her architecture or her career. She's often lauded as a great woman architect, but rarely as a great architect. I feel that this means that we still have a long way to go, both in terms of finally invalidating Julia Morgan's pessimism and in properly revising architectural histories. Julia Morgan was born in San Francisco in 1872, and she grew up in an apparently typical upper middle class Victorian household that adhered to conventional gender roles. She lived in this house for 40 years, from 1885, when she was 13, until 1925, when she was 53. Her father, Charles Morgan, settled in California in 1867. He came to California from Brooklyn by sailing around the tip of South America, and he brought his new bride, Eliza Woodland Parmley, with him. A mining engineer, he had seen the West as the place to make his fortune. Julia and her 4 siblings were raised in the large Victorian house, which sat across San Francisco Bay from San Francisco in Oakland. Julia's mother, Eliza Morgan, inherited a fortune upon her father's death in 1880, around which time she also invited her mother to come to live in California with them. The combined wealth of these 2 women, Julia's mother and grandmother, generated the financial stability and material comfort that marked Julia Morgan's childhood. As she grew up, Morgan learned that men could not necessarily be relied upon for financial, social, or emotional stability, and that women could embody great strength and power. After high school in Oakland, Morgan enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, where she studied civil engineering. She was often the sole woman in the mathematics and science courses that were required to fulfill her major. But she found regular community in a group of women in her sorority's chapter house who encouraged and fostered intellectual achievement. She and her cohort established the university's first real women's culture. They founded a chapter of the Young Women's Christian Association, organized several sports teams, and successfully fought for access to the gymnasium. Most importantly for Morgan, they chartered the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority. Characterized by academic excellence and exclusivity, It attracted a group of women who were particularly supportive of intellectual pursuits and who were affluent, well-connected members of society. The sorority hosted social events, including teas with professors' wives and influential society women. When she was a senior, Julia met the flamboyant architect Bernard Maybeck, who would go on to design some of the defining works of the Bay Area School of Architecture, such as the craftsman-style First Church of Christ Scientist, which we see here in Berkeley, completed in 1910. And here we see the interior of that same church with its very extensive truss work, and one of his residential projects. He also designed the neoclassical Palace of Fine Arts for the 1915 California Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. Maybeck gave Morgan a chance to work on the designs for his own home and studio while she was still at Berkeley. In 1894, she graduated with honors. Her thesis was entitled "A Structural Analysis of the Steel Frame of the Mills Building." Maybeck promptly hired Morgan to work at his studio and encouraged her to seek artistic training at the Mark Hopkins Institute of Art in San Francisco. He also suggested that she seriously consider attending, as he had, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, then the world's most prestigious architecture school. The only problem was that enrollment in the architecture curriculum was limited to men. Julia rose to the challenge. Could she crack the glass, perhaps iron ceiling of the École des Beaux-Arts? Fortunately, soon after her arrival in France in 1896, women there were in an uproar. While the École regularly accepted foreign men, this state-funded school barred female nationals, even though that many were anxious to study painting and sculpture. After extensive lobbying, French women gained admittance to the Department of Art in 1897. It was a step forward. Morgan spent her time touring France and Europe, creating sketches and watercolors of buildings she admired. She also began learning French and the metric system. In 1897, she was finally allowed to sit for the architecture examinations. In her first 2 attempts, she failed. This was not unusual. The majority of students took the École entrance examination several times. Morgan, however, clearly faced discrimination. When she learned that she failed the exam a second time in October 1897 because the jury did not want to encourage women applicants, she tried once again. Describing the failure to pass the oral examination, she wrote in a letter of 1898, quote, "There were 13 examined before me the day I came up, and everyone failed entirely. Those big, strong fellows would get up, tremble, turn white, clutch their hands, and seem to have no thinking power left." On November 14, 1898, Morgan passed the examination on her 3rd try and entered the École, ranking 13th out of 392 applicants. Only 30 of those applicants were accepted. She became the first woman to be accepted into the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts. Once accepted, the institution's centuries-old tradition of submitting work anonymously rendered Morgan's gender relatively moot, and in just over 3 years, as opposed to the average 6 years, she became the first woman to earn a degree in architecture at the school. Faculty and students alike had difficulty accepting a woman student. While hazing was a regular part of the École Atelier system, Morgan suffered more than her share. She had little time for horseplay. Her tenacity in seeking the diploma was notable. Many American students never completed the entire program at the Beaux-Arts, including such luminaries as Henry Hobson Richardson, Charles McKim, and Louis Sullivan. For them, the education received and the mere association with the école were sufficient to gain standing in the United States. But once again, Morgan graduated in 1902. She returned to Oakland in that same year, equipped with her prestigious degree, a strong sense of herself as a woman in a traditionally male profession, and the knowledge that she could overcome gender as an obstacle if her work were given the chance to speak for itself. Like all Americans who studied architecture at the École, Morgan expected to build a respectable career and to design structures of all types and sizes. Her parents and sister had assured her that the Bay Area was ripe for a building boom and that she would play a prominent role in it. She also secured a position in the office of John Galen Howard, the Beaux-Arts trained architect who had been appointed to oversee the final design and construction of the University of California campus at Berkeley, as well as to head its new School of Architecture. Morgan's relations with the imperious Howard were less than ideal. At one point, he boasted, "I have the best and most talented designer, whom I have to pay almost nothing, as it is a woman." During this time, Morgan helped design the Hearst Memorial Mining Building. Howard's concept mixed Mediterranean and California mission styles in a Beaux-Arts building. In the main atrium, soaring 50-foot ceilings contain skylights in vaulting that recall the hollowing out of a mountain, while the steel girders and balcony lattice work suggest the timber supports of a mining shaft. The design was partly inspired by the reading room of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. She also supervised the construction of the Greek Theater, a large, cast-in-place concrete amphitheater that fueled Morgan's exploration of the medium of reinforced concrete. At the conclusion of this project, she was one of the best informed persons in the state of California on reinforced concrete construction. In 1903, 77-year-old Susan Mills, the president of Mills College, selected Morgan to design a bell tower on campus. Mills College was the first institution for the advanced education of women west of the Rockies. Describing the proposed tower, El Campanile, Mills wrote, "We want this work to be a great success for many reasons. One, the greatest of these, it was planned by a woman for a women's college, and therefore we cannot afford to make mistakes. The Campanile was supposed to be sensitive to the college's history, yet signal the institution's transition from an almost obsolete frontier finishing school to a leading women's college of the 20th century." Morgan designed a 72-foot tall Spanish mission-style tower to stand among the California oaks in front of the seminary hall, the original campus building. The front and back measured twice as wide as the sides, and a series of low-pitched red tile roofs created colorful contrast to the drab concrete. In April 1904, El Campanile, as the tower was named, was unveiled with fanfare, praise, and public attention. The Campanile's mission style distinguished Mills College. Unlike Berkeley's Beaux-Arts or Stanford's Richardsonian Romanesque, it reflected only California and Mills College history, reinforcing its status as one of the oldest educational institutions on the West Coast. Morgan's design was derived from the California missions and incorporates Spanish vernacular elements. Questions of technology exposed tensions over power and creative authority between Julia Morgan and Bernard Ransom, the builder of the Campanile. Reinforced concrete construction was an important issue in California architecture at this time. Fierce arguments erupted between the designer and the contractor. Ransom's father introduced the technology to San Francisco in 1870. Morgan studied this technology in the mandatory construction course at the École, recognized as the most difficult requirement students faced. She also monitored building projects in Paris, and John Galen Howard named her supervising architect of the Greek Theater because of her expertise in reinforced concrete construction. But by the end of the project, Bernard Ransom deprived Julia Morgan of virtually all credit for El Campanile. His name appeared above Morgan's on the program for the dedication ceremony. He successfully exploited preconceived notions of gender difference to undermine her professional status and bolster his own. But El Campanile led directly to further commissions for Julia Morgan, especially when it survived the 1906 earthquake. President Mills was so pleased that she commissioned her to design the new campus library, to be named after the daughter of its benefactor, Andrew Carnegie. Morgan served unofficially as the campus architect for most of the next decade. Despite offers to work with architects on both coasts, Morgan was determined to set up an office of her own. After passing the licensing exam in 1904 and becoming the first woman to qualify to practice architecture in California, she opened a private practice in 1906. The size of her office fluctuated over the years, but averaged approximately 8 permanent draft people, a respectable size for the first half of the 20th century. The Morgan firm continued in operation until 1951. She was a demanding boss with high standards and expected over 100%, especially from her female employees. After joining the firm in 1917, Dorothy Koblenz remarked, "You couldn't put your pencil down unless it meant something." Everything that left the office had Morgan's final stamp of approval, almost always with personal changes. Employees were often frustrated by their lack of autonomy. For Morgan, total dedication to the profession was the only viable approach for an architect. She was openly disappointed when female employees married or chose alternative careers. She studiously avoided having a single-sex firm. Short and small-boned, she stood at 5 feet 2 inches and weighed 100 pounds. Morgan countered fears that she was too fragile to practice architecture by wearing pants under her skirt and fearlessly climbing rickety scaffolding. She displayed an even temperament at all times, so she could not be accused of nervousness or hysteria. She was a workaholic, devoting almost every waking hour, 18 hours a day, to architecture while living on chocolate bars and coffee. So far as is known, she never had a romantic relationship with anyone, male or female. She was simply too busy. She was close to her family and to her staff, who she shepherded like they were her own children. Morgan shunned attention of any kind. Her dislike of notoriety probably resulted from society's censure of self-promotion by women, and the many inaccurate articles written about her when she was at the École des Beaux-Arts. In contrast to the majority of male practitioners who actively sought publicity to build their client lists, Morgan rarely gave interviews and refused to place signs with her name on her building sites. She proclaimed, "My buildings speak, I do not speak." As a result, Morgan relied heavily upon repeat business and word-of-mouth promotion. She strongly advised other architects to accept any job, no matter how small, since they didn't know where it might lead. There are very few photographs taken of Julia Morgan after the 1920s where she can be seen clearly. This was partly due to a botched inner ear surgery done in 1932. During the initial operation, The doctor accidentally cut a facial nerve, which left one side of her face partially paralyzed. While she'd always shunned press interviews, after the operation, she excused herself by claiming that it was inappropriate for an architect to be asymmetrical. What would we do today if a doctor ruined our face? Probably sue. What did Julia Morgan do? Knowing how badly the doctor felt, she sent him a bouquet of flowers every year on the anniversary of the operation. Not only did the operation ruin her looks, her equilibrium was also thrown off to the extent that observers who didn't know her thought she was drunk most of the time. When reading plans, several witnesses said they saw her suddenly pitch over onto the table face first and then recover. In addition to other burdens, Morgan quietly took on the care of her family. Almost every member of her nuclear family experienced tragedy. In 1913, her brother Sam, a fire chief, died at age 33 after a streetcar hit his auto on the way to a fire. In 1918, her brother Parmalee died after a long, painful fight against neurosyphilis, considered shameful at the time. Her mother Eliza had a stroke shortly after the brother died, from which she never fully recovered, although she lived until 1930, requiring Julia's constant care. Her father had a massive stroke in 1923 and died a year later. Julia's brother Avery, one of her closest relationships, developed early onset dementia in the 1920s. Morgan took care of him for the rest of his life. He was known to wander, and his body was found 9 months after disappearing from a healthcare facility in 1943. Julia Morgan was completely at ease in her professional environment. She wore comfortable shoes, silk blouses, and suits with big pockets that bulged with pads and pencils. She didn't carry a purse that might have hampered her in climbing scaffolds. After the surgery, which also affected her sense of balance, she still climbed to the tops of buildings while holding on to a worker. On April 18, 1906, one of the seminal events in California history took place: the San Francisco earthquake and resultant fires. More than 80% of the city's buildings were destroyed. The Grand Fairmont Hotel, only days from opening, was gutted by flames, leaving only a shell. The hotel's owners, determined to rebuild, turned to Julia Morgan. They were impressed that her bell tower and Carnegie Library survived the earthquake intact, serving as models of reinforced concrete construction. It was a huge project in terms of both prestige and commissions, and drew much attention in the press. Word that a woman had been hired to renovate the luxurious hotel was met with astonishment. Was the building really in charge of a woman? A reporter asked the project's foreman in 1907. Yes, the foreman answered. An architect's an architect, and you can count on them all. You can count them all on the fingers of one hand, he said. Now, this building is in the charge of a real architect, and her name happens to be Julia Morgan, but it might as well be John Morgan. In 1907, 3 years after establishing a private practice and moving her office back and forth between her parents' carriage house and San Francisco, Morgan opened a permanent office in the Merchants Exchange building, which was located in the heart of the city's financial district. As you can see from the photo on the right, Daniel Burnham's 1903 building was one of the few survivors of the earthquake and fire. Morgan soon developed a reputation for listening intently to her clients' needs and desires. She was generous to her employees and mentored them closely. Laborers and artisans had only respect for her. She paid close attention to detail, employed the most modern building technologies, and always demanded high-quality work. As a marginalized professional, Morgan relied heavily on satisfied customers to bring in more work. She charged low commissions, shared profits with her employees, and kept little money for herself. She was not especially known for her residential work, yet designed many still standing and impressive homes, which we will see chronologically here. One of the earliest was the North Star House in Grass Valley, California. The exterior presents a very California aesthetic with its stone foundation and columns and shingled upper story. Yet the interior is very Asian in appearance, with the exception of a craftsman fireplace, which we see in this room. The especially heavy beams and restrained, simple lines of the paneling are very Japanese influenced. Though Morgan designed very livable houses, she was not an expert in domestic needs. She insisted on having impractically low kitchen sinks at 2 feet 8 inches rather than 3 feet, perhaps an idiosyncratic reflection of her own short stature. But Morgan showed great variety in her residential designs. The Wilson House, designed in a neoclassical Beaux-Arts fashion and built in 1909, is located in Vallejo, California. The exterior is in the Bay tradition craftsman style and very reminiscent of her mentor, Bernard Maybeck's work, with huge eaves and gigantic brackets. The interior is in a homey and light neo-colonial style in a vastly simplified format. And just to give you a quick look at the variety of styles she employed on her residential work, we see here an example of Spanish colonial. And this gigantic 24,350 square foot, 4-level Hillsborough, California home with 11 bedrooms, 9 full bathrooms, and 5 half bathrooms. Julia converted and expanded a drab old Victorian into what George Hearst, son of William Randolph Hearst, said he wanted, which was a Western White House. Victorian gloom was replaced with Georgian simplicity, and light, airy windows let in the California sun. Morgan also designed several churches of note, especially her 1910 masterpiece, the St. John's Presbyterian in Berkeley. It was built in the American craftsman style with an exterior wood shingle finish known as Berkeley brown shingle. Julia Morgan and her assistant Walter Stylberg chose a design with broad gables and a stained shingles, I'm sorry. The redwood paneled interior leaves the wooden beams and trusses completely exposed, while smoked glass clear-story windows provide most of the light. This structural exhibitionism forms a worship space of great visual interest. The small scale of the church and the warm color of the wood help to create a cozy and restful space with the unadorned beauty of natural materials. Morgan herself considered it to be her best craftsman building. In addition to work at Mills College, Morgan had especially strong connections at UC Berkeley and knew the university's foremost patron, Phoebe Aberson Hearst, whom she'd met as a student and again in Paris. Hearst had even offered to finance Morgan's schooling at the École des Beaux-Arts, an offer which Julia politely declined. After setting up an independent practice, Morgan was offered many commissions from women's groups. She designed nearly 100 buildings for women's organizations in California and beyond. These included cultural, social, and civic clubs, academic, residential, and recreational buildings, primary schools and orphanages for boys and girls, and hospitals, sanitariums, and nursing residences. Between 1912 and 1930, she designed more than 30 buildings in at least 17 locations for the YWCA, one of the nation's largest and most influential women's organizations. Morgan lost money on many of these projects, but she kept accepting them. In keeping with public and commercial architectural norms of the day, the buildings were generally wood frame or reinforced concrete structures in the Mission, Renaissance, Spanish colonial, Tudor, Gothic, or classical revival styles. Morgan often combined elements from several of these traditions, creating a more generic Italianate or Mediterranean style. Particularly if budgets were tight, she worked in the Bay tradition style, a regional variation on the arts and crafts aesthetic characterized by wood shingle roofs with wide eave overhangs, unpainted wood exteriors and interiors, clinker brick or stone elements such as chimneys or porch columns, and minimal ornamentation. And just as a quick aside, the Asilomar Center, which is near Monterey, California, is a wonderful place to visit if you haven't been there. And it's an entire campus of a retreat center for the YWCA that Morgan designed over a number of years. It's the second most visited California state historic site, just after the other big project she designed, Hearst Castle, which is #1. So the two most visited California state parks were both designed by Julia Morgan. The largest and most powerful women's group at the turn of the 20th century, again, was the YWCA, and Julia Morgan came in contact with the Y through her sorority sister, Grace Fisher. As president of the Oakland chapter in 1910, Fisher steered the commission for a new facility to Morgan's studio. Looking like a Renaissance palace on the exterior, the 4-story reinforced concrete building in Oakland was the first of over 30 buildings Morgan designed for the YWCA over the next 20 years. The project began with a much larger budget than actually materialized, so Julia had to keep downsizing the plan. Like Marie de' Medici's palace in Florence, the main facade is divided into 3 parts and features rustication, a series of arched windows, and a ribbon of windows at the top. In contrast to the Medici Palace, Julia designed floral-themed glazed terracotta tile work and a wrought iron balcony on the 3rd level to create color and visual interest. The interior court, meanwhile, looks much like Bramante's cloister at Santa Maria della Pace and features uplifting verses from the Bible on the 1st level cornice. When the YWCA opened to the public in 1915, the Oakland Tribune said that it was nothing less than, quote, a triumph of architectural beauty, a monument to woman's ability, and a landmark expressing her sympathy for other women, her sense of responsibility, and her deepening love for all other women. It's interesting that Julia was so publicity shy because in 1913 she came into close proximity with newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, the only child of Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a man who was one of the most publicity conscious and publicity seeking individuals in American history. Morgan was chosen to design the new Los Angeles Examiner building to house his 6th newspaper. The building would stand on an entire city block in downtown Los Angeles, and Hearst used his newspapers to ballyhoo the event. Julia knew Hearst from a decade earlier when she'd worked on the Greek Theater at Berkeley. She also designed a mansion for Hearst in Sausalito in 1908, but only the retaining wall was ever built. The Examiner building was the first commission that the client and architect completed together. Morgan designed the Examiner building in the Mission Revival style, popular throughout Southern California in the early 20th century. The structure is made of reinforced concrete. The building's red tile roof and blue and yellow tiled domes make it a visible neighborhood landmark. The Examiner building has an elaborate lobby of grand arched spaces lined with carved marble friezes, wood trusses spanning high ceilings, and a patterned tile floor. The gold and marble of the entry area can also be found on the top level, where Hearst maintained a private apartment for entertaining. This was an era before radio, television, 24-hour news cycles, the internet, and smartphones, and people obtained their news from print newspapers. Publishing newspapers was big business, and Hearst was building a media empire, so the opulence and size of the building were fitting for its purpose. On the exterior, note the loggia up on the third level. You can see in the left-hand picture. And this is from that vantage point. This is a porch area just off of Hearst's private apartment, which he maintained in the Examiner building. The building housed the newspaper's offices until 1989, when the Herald Examiner closed. Within a few years, Hearst Corporation explored demolishing the building to make way for a parking lot. The beautiful facade showed signs of deterioration, while all the lower-level windows were blocked up with plywood. Over the following decades, the building became a popular filming location, even as it fell into disrepair and the surrounding area became neglected and underutilized. The building was perfect for movie making because its walls were solid and shut out noise. Plus, it was large enough to build sets inside the space. In 2016, Georgetown Company partnered with the Hearst Corporation to redevelop the building into an approximately 115,000 square foot creative office space and retail project. The $80 million project sought to adaptively reuse the former newspaper offices and production facility for multiple mixed-use commercial tenants and catalyze the neighborhood's revitalization. And in these photos, by the way, during the renovation period, you can see Julia's extensive reinforced concrete design for the building, the bones of it. Away from the showy public spaces, the reinforced concrete structure of the building can be seen here in the 2016 photo. Julia Morgan received funding from individuals who had faith in her to build their houses. A second source of money was women's groups who sought her out to build their clubhouses and YWCA buildings. She was also supported by 2 colleges. But her largest source of funding came through a wealthy patron, William Randolph Hearst. During World War I, Morgan designed many hostess houses for soldiers where they could receive hot coffee, donuts, and interact with local women volunteers. These houses were meant to foster a home-like atmosphere for lonely soldiers miles from their real homes. They were designed to be built quickly and cheaply. Meanwhile, her residential work continued with straightforward and increasingly modern designs. She also continued to work on the Mills College campus, including this nice little student union building in a mission style with Doric columns. The interior shows her continuing reverence for wood and also for the exposed trusses that dominate so many of her large open spaces for churches, auditoriums, and meeting rooms. Morgan was hired in January 1917 for the construction of a one-room frame church at the intersection of Harwood and College Avenues in Berkeley. The budget allotment was a frugal $10,000, a very modest sum, even then, for a community building. The completed building is a cross between California mission architecture and Chinese design, especially the large round window in the confluence with the triangular roofline. Morgan's work utilizes minimal ornamentation and shows elegance and restraint while managing to be warm and personal at the same time. There are a number of devices used by Morgan to foster this comfortable feeling, the use of symmetrical forms, color, and combination of materials. For the Charles Girtham house, Morgan changed gears to go with one of her favorite architectural styles, Mediterranean. True to her attention to detail, decorative friezes, capitals, molding, and ironwork embellish a perfectly balanced Mediterranean-style facade. Inside, the floor plan is symmetrical. The wood is natural teak. Many of the architectural details in the house were designed by Julia Morgan herself and made by master craftsmen. In creating the Ming Kwang Home for Orphan Chinese Girls in 1925, Morgan resolved conflicting racial tensions between her clients, Aurelia Reinhardt, president of the adjacent Mills College, and the famed missionary Donaldina Cameron. Reinhardt wanted to keep the facility from moving into the neighborhood and later insisted on screening it off with trees. Racial prejudice was still very high in California in the 1920s, but Morgan included Chinese motifs in the building, compromising by making sure the structure fit harmoniously with the Mediterranean-style architecture of Mills College a few blocks away. The $125,000 building for 65 girls opened in December 1925. It was named Ming Kwang, or Radiant Light. Morgan designed a U-shaped, painted, reinforced concrete building of 2 stories plus a basement, with a red clay tile gable roof and teal blue wide eave overhangs. Multi-light wood frame casement windows abound on every elevation, allowing natural light to flood all the rooms. The building features many Chinese cultural references, including a pailu, or traditional Chinese gateway, which lends monumentality to the structure. Chinese food dogs sit atop the pailu, guarding the entrance and courtyard and flanking a large lotus flower leaf, a symbol of purity. Other cultural references include glazed blue, brown, and green punch tiles from China, which break up the monotony of the frieze. Large flower boxes with decorative raised panels, carved brackets, and Chinese finials hang below the second-story windows, overlooking the courtyard and part of the north and south elevations. In 1999, the building's original purpose as a haven for young girls came full circle with its establishment as a middle school inspired by its namesake, the Julia Morgan School for Girls. 3 years after Ming Kwang opened, the San Francisco YWCA initiated a building program that resulted in one of Julia Morgan's masterpieces. The new building for the Chinatown YWCA was built concurrently with and adjacent to an 8-story residence for the San Francisco YWCA Association. The relationship between the 2 buildings suggests the changing dynamics between Anglo and Chinese women in San Francisco. Whereas affluent Anglo women had previously dominated the fundraising, design, and operations of charities and welfare organizations, women of Chinese heritage largely controlled the creation and operations of the Chinatown YWCA. Morgan's L-shaped residence building straddled the affluent neighborhood of Nob Hill and Chinatown, blurring the traditional boundaries between the Anglo and Chinese communities. Her design for the Chinatown YWCA rejected Chinese building stereotypes that emerged after the 1906 earthquake and fires, and integrated authentic Chinese motifs within the framework of Western architecture. Suitably, today the building is home to the Chinese Historical Society of America. Morgan worked closely with the all-Chinese board of the Chinese YWCA on the design. Inside, Morgan applied a traditional Chinese color scheme with red posts, a red and green ceiling, and blue and gold stencils. A Chinese dragon painted into the concrete floor of a hallway looks out onto a meditation patio and koi pond. This dragon motif continues subtly in the curvature of a stairway behind the entrance desk which features a gold screen. Morgan researched the meanings of traditional Chinese symbols, infinity and longevity knots, chrysanthemums, and bats for good luck, and had them hand-painted in each square of the entry's coffered ceiling. The building committee wanted a gymnasium and allotted it a full 3/4 of the construction budget. Note the beautiful lattice truss system. Morgan waived her fee for the building. One of Morgan's final commissions for California women was the Berkeley Women's City Club, created in response to challenges that women's clubs faced by the late 1920s. Because it became so much more expensive to maintain these individual buildings, Olga Beebe, chief accountant of the American Trust Company in Berkeley, proposed an idea in 1925 for a collaborative women's club building. The building provided facilities for numerous individual clubs, housing for single women, and social, cultural, recreational, and retail spaces. The Berkeley Women's City Club opened its doors in 1930. Morgan's Romanesque and Gothic design complemented the surrounding built environment. It drew upon castles, cathedrals, cloisters, and skyscrapers. The Romanesque and Gothic-inspired elements of the club's entrance archway were stately and noble, but decorated with vines and flowers, transforming architectural symbols of traditional masculine power into feminine representations of modern womanhood. Morgan combined classical and Gothic architectural elements in the Corinthian columns, banister trefoils, and vaulted ceiling of the grand staircase. But the greatest surprise awaits, one of Julia Morgan's most subtly beautiful spaces. She loved to design pools, and she created several very memorable ones during her career. I find the pool she designed for the Berkeley Women's City Club to be her most beautiful. Flanked by Corinthian columns like those of a cloister, a series of graceful concrete archways surmount the design. The aqua and tan color scheme emphasizes the water and simulates a sunny sky. Rebar doubles as structural reinforcement and decoration in the arches over the pool, literally exposing the modern technology that made the building possible. Indeed, Walter Stylberg, who worked with Morgan, cited this building as the most complicated engineering problem of his long career, and as of 1976, probably, quote, the most complicated concrete structure in this part of the country. The reinforced concrete pool structure and arches are load-bearing, so the entire weight of the 5 stories above this space is supported by these Gothic arches. It was this that made the engineering problem so great in the design of the space. Presently, this Berkeley City Club, the building now functions as a private club and hotel. We simply don't have time this evening to scratch the surface of all of Julia Morgan's projects. As just one quick for instance, William Randolph Hearst had her design an entire fairy tale Bavarian village in the Sierras north of Lake Tahoe in the early 1930s. It was called Windtune. Her whimsical copies of German buildings and a mix of fairy tale background stories remind one of Disneyland, which came about more than 20 years later. And this is her Cinderella house, which has paintings on the exterior from the fairy tale. The design Morgan's most famous for is the one that usually overshadows everything else. I feel that this is unfair, and that's why we haven't discussed Hearst Castle at all until now. Hopefully you can see that she would be considered a major architect today if she hadn't even designed Hearst Castle. Located about halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles, a 4-hour drive from either one, the site is one of great interest to the public and the most visited site in the California State Park System. The castle is placed on a high ridge rising above the simple Pacific Ocean Bay at San Simeon, which has virtually no buildings and is not a popular beach. The castle is intriguing because it's so odd, so extravagant, and because it was never completed. Julia Morgan spent 28 years working on the immense estate, yet client William Randolph Hearst received most of the credit for the design. A preoccupation with client wishes can be detrimental to the development of a signature style. At San Simeon, Morgan gave Hearst exactly what he wanted, a hedonistic enclave in an eclectic collage of styles. It's interesting, the biographer, one of the first biographers of Morgan in 1972, went to visit Hearst Castle and mentioned Julia Morgan's name as the designer, and no one there knew who she was talking about. Such accommodation diminished her stature within the architectural community, which criticized her for not developing a unique personal style or a recognizable aesthetic theory, but she wasn't seeking wealth. However, between 1919 and 1939, her practice cleared nearly $1 million in profits on projects for William Randolph Hearst alone. Morgan never charged more than 6% for residential design and took a salary, not a commission, for her work on the multi-million-dollar San Simeon project. At her death, she left a very modest estate. William Randolph Hearst went into the newspaper business in 1887. By the 1920s, he owned the first nationwide media chain, including newspapers and magazines. His yellow journalism found its market. An estimated 1 in 5 Americans, including many of the poor and immigrant classes, read Hearst newspapers. Hearst's appetite for luxury matched his ambitions in politics and business. The owner of 8 treasure-filled homes, he built his castle in the 1920s, which playwright George Bernard Shaw famously described as, quote, the place God would have built if he'd had the money. Though Hearst had married a young New York chorus girl, Millicent Wilson, in 1903, his marriage soured in 1915 when he met 18-year-old Marion Davies, another showgirl. Hearst never divorced. His wife and 2 boys lived in New York, while Hearst lived with Davies in California. The mansion on the hill at San Simeon was built for Davies. San Simeon became a playground for Hearst, Davies, and Hollywood luminaries, including Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, Carole Lombard, Harpo Marx, and Greta Garbo. William Randolph Hearst died in 1951 at age 88, the same year that Morgan retired. 4 years after Morgan designed the Los Angeles Examiner building, Hearst hired her again, initially asking her to help him build a modest bungalow at his ranch in San Simeon. After his mother died in 1919, leaving him her huge personal fortune, Hearst began spending like a drunken sailor. Morgan's commission turned into an extraordinary, long-running architect-client relationship that produced a vast castle of fantastic pan-European architecture, augmented by fragments of historic buildings from Europe. Altogether, there were over 10,000 drawings made for Hearst Castle. Morgan spent 28 years working continuously with Hearst, spending a majority of her weekends on site. The castle became Julia Morgan's most famous work. The Mediterranean-style city on a hill had 3 guest villas for a combined total of 46 rooms, linked by a series of elaborately landscaped Italian and Spanish gardens, esplanades, walkways, and plazas, to the main house, Casa Grande, a towering 115-room castle cathedral. Julia Morgan was architect, landscape architect, and interior designer. Hearst constantly asked for changes, which most architects detest, but Morgan took it in stride. I will do my very best to keep the costs down, she said, but as you know, both the times and the local conditions are full of uncertainties. Altogether, they exchanged some 2,462 letters and telegrams during the life of the project. Her organized, disciplined mind helped her to stay ahead of Hearst's whims. The hilltop cluster of buildings had no neighbors. And climbing up from the autos, a visitor would first see some of the guest houses and turn around for great views of the surrounding country and looks down to the bay. When Julia Morgan was at the ranch, she always sat next to Hearst at dinner. When viewing the mansion, you must always keep in mind how cleverly Morgan incorporated Hearst's collection into the design scheme, especially of the interiors. It was her job to create spaces that were not entirely of her own taste or choosing, out of pieces that were like a jigsaw puzzle. As a counterpoint to the Neptune pool, which you see here, Morgan also designed the castle's cerulean Roman pool, a show-stopping indoor swimming area that might as well have been rescued from the lost city of Atlantis. Almost every surface is covered with Italian-inspired mosaics made from 1 by 1 inch Venetian glass tiles, some infused with 22-karat gold. Marble ladders curl up from the water's gleaming surface like seahorses, while alabaster lamps emit a ghostly glow. It's a space of pure delight designed by an unfettered imagination. Exiting the pool, you can see the tennis courts where Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks once played. If you look around corners, you can see the unfinished state of the castle and the fact that the decor is a veneer over reinforced concrete. Especially when you walk around the back of the building, you can see the reinforced concrete with the board impressions still on it. And then on the front, you have the veneer of the stone over the surface, which disguises it. San Simeon remained a work in progress. Nothing was allowed to stay as it was. The terraces and pathways were enlarged on a regular basis. The roof of Casa Grande was raised in 1927 and again in 1931 to provide more space for the upper suites. When Hearst could no longer afford it, construction stopped in 1947. Not long after, the site became a California state park. Julia Morgan's greatest project remained a work in progress that was never really directed by her, but co-opted by her client. Still, her genius shines through in every aspect of the Hearst estate. By the time she retired in 1951, at age 79, Julia Morgan had designed at least 700 buildings and sites. By the 1950s, the emphasis was on the new, modern, and the heroic, not to mention on architecture to house the masses. Morgan, who never married, died on February 2nd, 1957, at her apartment in San Francisco. She was 85 years old and largely forgotten. In 1957, women still represented only 1% of all architects in the United States. The architecture, construction, and engineering fields were all still dominated by men. Yet, all the biases against her she turned into assets, said Julia Donahoe, an architect and lawyer who successfully nominated Morgan for the 2014 American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, the first time the organization had awarded its highest honor to a woman. She added, quote, "I don't know why we didn't learn about Julia Morgan in school, but I hope that oversight will never happen again." So with that, I will bring this program to a close. I hope that you have enjoyed the program itself. And if you have any questions, I'm sure you can forward them through Trent Sindelar or John Gunther, and they can reach me, and I'd be glad to send you responses to any questions you have. So thank you for your attention, and I'm hoping to be with you again soon in the flesh. Take care and good evening.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. We invite you to please join us for the 2026 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. We will announce the series soon, so you may place the dates on your calendars. We hope you'll be able to join us in person at the St. Louis Public Library Central Library Auditorium or virtually via live stream on YouTube through the Steedman Architectural Library, St. Louis Public Library on the fourth Tuesday of February, March, April, September, October, and November, except during Thanksgiving week at 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. Have a wonderful remainder of the year and happy holidays.